The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. In July 1947, noted U.S. diplomat George F. Kennan published a seminal article entitled The Sources of Soviet Conduct in the journal Foreign Affairs. As an aide to President Truman said at the time, Kennan tied everything together, wrapped in a neat package, and put a red bow around it. Well, nearly 70 years later, Russian intentions are again top of mind among many U.S. policymakers. Vladimir Putin has had an improbably prominent place in the U.S. presidential campaign, and the Kremlin's perceived grand strategy is impacting Washington's relations across Europe and beyond. To provide an update on the current sources of Russian conduct, we're once again joined by Jeffrey Sommers, professor of political economy at UW-Milwaukee and senior fellow at the Institute of World Affairs. He also serves as visiting faculty at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. He's just returned from a trip to Moscow and Latvia. Jeff, welcome back.
Doug, nice to see you.
Well, let me start with a quote here, an analysis of Russian intentions, if I could. Russia has no intention of going to war with America or its allies. Instead, it will act through non-military means to undermine the general political and strategic potential of major Western powers, to disrupt national self-confidence, to increase social and industrial unrest, and to stimulate all forms of disunity. And that analysis was provided in 1946 by George Kennan. So are we back to the future on this?
Yeah, I guess so. We're reprising the past to a certain extent. I mean, I think that on one level, of course, Kennan was both right then, and perhaps if we look at his analysis today, correct as well. We see a Russia which certainly does not want to go to war with the United States, yet at the same time, and very disturbingly, especially in terms of what I was hearing from colleagues, both in Latvia and in Russia, there seems to be this growing sense that war could come, not as something that would be sought, but something that just could eventually, as a consequence of the tensions between the two countries, surface. And of course, that's quite unsettling, just to even contemplate that thought.
So you travel to the region frequently.
Yes, I do.
Tell me, how has the mood changed since your last trip? I mean, you just got back. So what was different this time around?
Yeah. Well, again, there's this increasing sense that something could happen in terms of some conflict between Russia and the United States, or Russia and NATO, and that could trigger some kind of conflict. I was talking with an old friend of mine who has served as a government minister in the Republic of Latvia. He's ethnic Russian, and he was telling me that his colleagues in Russia were suggesting that it's no longer unthinkable again that war could actually come, that they feel that they're being pressured by NATO, and they feel they're being pressured by the United States specifically. And there's this sense among certain elements or factions, which are quite sizable, I guess we could call them chauvinists or revanchists, that should such conflict come, that they're ready for it. And so that, just again, to be thinking in those terms is I think, not helpful, but it is illustrative of the problems that we have in terms of U.S.-Russian relations today.
Well, 4 years ago, we were in the thick of another presidential campaign, yes. And Mitt Romney characterized Russia as the most serious geopolitical foe of the United States at the time, and was widely mocked for it. I think there'd be less snickering these days. What's changed over those 4 years? Yeah,
there certainly would be. Well, of course, it's Russia's assertion of its interests, and so if we go back to 2008, Russia was quite perturbed by the United States' interventions in the politics of the Republic of Georgia. And of course, Russia has this strategic depth strategy in terms of defending itself, in terms of conflicts which may emerge. And this goes back to the Napoleonic Wars. So the Russian policymakers more or less have this view that on the one hand, you need to defend yourself in the West from any potential invasion, because Russia always seems to need a half a year or a year to get itself together before it can actually mount any serious defense. And so you want additional territory in that direction in order to exhaust your opponent coming in. But in the South, you certainly want firm control over the Caucasus, and to ensure that there's no potential for future incursion there by an enemy force. So the Russians were getting very discouraged by visits from people like Senator John McCain and Lindsey Graham and others, who seemed to be whipping up this anti-Russian sentiment and suggesting that membership in NATO was the solution to the perceived security concerns that they had. Now, this didn't go over very well in Russia, not at all. And of course, we saw Russia's intervention in the Civil War in Georgia, which emerged. And from the Russian perspective, I mean, this was designed to send a signal to the United States that, this is not a direction that you want to continue going in. But of course, as we know, a few years later, we saw problems again, this time, of course, in Ukraine. And so this is where we saw the situation become far more difficult, because Ukraine is a much larger country. Russia's interests there are far greater, and the United States' investment in Ukraine is much more significant as well.
So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the cultural and almost emotional, if you will, aspect of this. I mean, the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the chaos that followed and the loss of status and stature was traumatic, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And in fact, Russia reverted to a kind of industrial gathering society. I mean, you had people who still nominally had employment at factories, but they weren't being paid any wages. They were literally going out into the countryside to derive whatever sustenance they could from gathering berries or hunting, or by whatever means they could find some additional supplement for their diets. And so it was a total breakdown. And this is something, of course, that the Russian state is determined to not see repeated. In other words, they saw chaos and a breakdown of order following 1917 in Russia, and they saw it again in the 1990s. And so they're quite determined to not see this kind of thing reprised. Well,
and you mentioned just food and sustenance. Yeah. Famously, the Bush administration dumped poultry into Russia at the time, which became colloquially known as bush legs.
Yes.
And at one time, it was 60% of the Russian poultry market that had been captured. So there's something about, not only don't we have food, but the food we do have is coming from our old foe from decades back.
Yeah, there was a kind of a humiliation there in terms of being almost really entirely dependent on foreigners.
So one of the things that came from that, and this is a hotly disputed aspect of the history in terms of what each side expected of the other, is NATO enlargement. Mm-hmm. And from the Russian perspective, there was a tacit agreement or an explicit agreement that said, we will not bring NATO to your borders. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the Cold War, as dangerous as it was, I mean, it took place in the heart of Europe. And so from that perspective, it wasn't quite as dangerous as the Cold War version 2 that we're seeing today, because in this new version, the conflict is right on Russia's very borders. And so they're far more sensitive to what could happen in the future. From Russia's perspective, of course, having lost upwards of 20 to 30 million people in World War II, they're quite concerned about any potential for future conflict. Of course, from the perspective of the United States, this concern appears to be unwarranted. From the Russian perspective, history is long and you never know what's going to happen in terms of change. So we have a different set of normative assumptions by both countries regarding what should and what should not be. But you address a very important point, and that is that there's a dynamic that takes place, or that has taken place between these two countries, and they're very much reacting to each other and really not listening to each other. There's an old Russian joke that goes something like, in my apartment building, I have this neighbor. He's just impossible. He's quite crazy. At 3 a.m, he's banging on the radiators. screaming, banging on the walls. But, it's okay because at that hour I'm playing my accordion anyway. And, so in other words, we have two actors here that are really influencing each other. Now, I don't want to suggest any kind of false equivalencies, but I think it's equally as easy to suggest that all of the problems are just coming from one side. We have two different perspectives on both events in the distant past and the medium past, and since the post-Soviet turn as well. And Russia feels that its interests have not been taken into account, and it's more or less just been read the riot act on several different issues, whether it be the dissolution of the ABM Treaty or several others in which the United States has more or less, from their perspective, in a kind of condescending way, said, don't worry, everything is fine. You're not going to be adversely affected by these changes. But from the Russian perspective, it's not partnership. It's the United States essentially, telling them how things are going to be. Or as what George Bush once said, what we say goes.
Well, some time ago, Hillary Clinton, before she was a presidential candidate, characterized Mr. Putin as having no soul. And Mr. Putin's response was, international relations must be built without emotion on the basis of fundamental interests. So is there an ideological side to what the government of Russia is pursuing right now, or is it pretty much straight realism in the international relations sense?
It's chiefly realism, but it's guided increasingly by the sense that the United States can't be trusted, and so it's giving a lot of traction to, again, these revanchist or chauvinist factions, which I've mentioned previously, which actually Putin has done a good bit to try and control. And so we often don't understand that his chief political opposition does not come from the left, it comes from his right flank. And he is actually kind of a moderating influence in terms of keeping them in check. Now, that's not to suggest that his intentions regarding the United States are entirely good, but we do need to beware of what alternatives exist in Russia. And there is this sense that you alluded to before that Russia has been humiliated and that somehow it really needs to reassert its power much more aggressively and strongly. For the most part, Putin has actually worked to restrain and constrain that tendency. Of course, in Ukraine, things broke down. There was this sense from the perspective of the Russians and even of Putin that the situation could have gotten out of control very quickly, that Ukraine could have been brought into NATO, and that it would have lost its access to the Black Sea, which from its perspective would have been a catastrophic loss. Now, again, we can argue whether or not that's the case, but that perception definitely exists. And had Putin probably not acted in Crimea, there's quite a strong possibility that the Russian military would have. They were not going to stand by and watch this happen.
Well, you do a lot of work in Latvia and elsewhere in the region. Let's talk a little bit about how this plays out in those countries. But I think first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back with more.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with Jeffrey Sommers about Russia's grand strategy. So we mentioned you've just returned from Riga. How does what we've been talking about in terms of sort of Russian view of the world play out in the Balkans?
In the Baltics, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry,
that's okay.
Baltics.
They're small, so we sometimes forget. But on one level, I would say the average person has been kind of terrified by events that we have seen over the past few years, because the Baltic states, of course, were forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, and it was a very unpleasant incorporation. It occurred, of course, as World War II was unfolding, and the Soviets were not acting in any kind of nuanced manner to determine who was a serious threat and who was not. The long and the short of it is, a lot of people were tragically affected. Many were sent off to camps in Siberia. Many top-level officials were executed. And in the tens of thousands, people left those respective three states, among them my spouse's family. So they have very serious concerns about Russia, given that it's this neighbor and one which has, for the past few hundred years, been the sovereign authority in those three Baltic states. So they have that very, very, very serious concern about what lies ahead.
And has that changed recently? I mean, is the level
it's been, yeah. So with the annexation of Crimea, people became concerned that the Baltic states were next. It wasn't really much of a concern for myself, because I know that the Russian government is not really interested in taking the Baltics. I mean, there's really not much that they can do with them. They're not of great strategic value at this point. It doesn't mean in the future that there's not that threat. I mean, we could return to a 1938 moment when the Soviets viewed the Baltic states as increasingly important strategically, because negotiations broke down between them and the British and the French regarding trying to contain Hitler. So Stalin pivots and makes an alliance actually with the Germans and grabs the Baltic states. Now, there's no direct analogy there, but it is to suggest that the Russians in the future, if relations continue to deteriorate, they could begin to see the Baltics again as strategically important for that strategic depth issue, which I referenced before. But right now, the Baltic states are kind of the playground of Russia's oligarchs. I mean, they all have, their big mansions there, and they very much enjoy their lives there, and they like being outside of Russia, and they also use it as an offshore financial center for, the laundering of their cash and for avoiding taxation in Russia. Now, of course, that could create problems with the Russian state at some point in the future, too. The Russians are, the Russian government is looking increasingly and slowly to disengage from the Baltic states. So a lot of their rail transit traffic, much of it oil, is being diverted away from the Baltic states. And so they're actually sending it north to Primorsk, where they've built a major port facility near St. Petersburg. And they're also making agreements with Belarus to give them reduced rail rates if they actually send their transit traffic to the more lengthy and thus more expensive route of north to Primorsk, but minimizing those costs for the shippers themselves. So, relations, unfortunately, are very, very bad right now between the Baltic states and Russia.
Well, one of the issues, certainly in the Ukraine and elsewhere, has been the perceived discomfiture of the ethnic Russians in those countries.
Right.
And I know Latvia's got a considerable, something in the 24%, something like that, ethnic Russian population. Mm-hmm. What are relations like between those segments of the populations within the Baltic states?
In the main, pretty good. I mean, there was, of course, this episode in Estonia a few years ago when there was this World War II monument that the Estonian government decided to move, and so the Russian community got quite upset about that, and there were big protests in the streets and all the rest. In the main, relations between these communities are decent, except the Russian population does often see themselves as victims of state policies which are designed to curtail their right to be educated in their own language and to really maintain a kind of distinct, autonomous cultural identity. Now, of course, from the perspective of the Baltic states, I mean, that's precisely the concern, that they could become a fifth column in the future, and that the Russian state could use that for any future occupation should one occur. But by generating tensions between the ethnic Russians and the ethnic Balts, they bring themselves, ironically, closer to an eventuality in which perhaps some kind of a conflict could emerge, and the Russian state would use those populations for that very purpose. So it's a vexing issue, how to deal with it. I think on the whole, the Baltic states have done a reasonably good job, although there are some points of minutia regarding history tests, which are part of the citizenship tests, which kind of unnecessarily, to my mind, create some tensions. But on the whole, they do reasonably well within the three Baltic states, and there's no great rush for them to leave. They know they've got it better there than in Russia itself.
Well, there are sympathetic parties and factions throughout Europe that Mr. Putin has tried to cultivate relationships with. In the main, the new sort of populist movements, Madame Le Pen in France and her counterparts elsewhere. Talk a little bit about that. I mean, that certainly would not have been ideologically a simpatico relationship under the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, we need to remember that Putin is not somebody who viewed the Soviet Union very sympathetically. He thought one of the reasons that the Russian Empire fell apart was because the Soviets were, one, adventurous in terms of their foreign policy, and two, unrealistic in their goals in terms of creating a new man and a utopian future. And he thought that they, as he said at one point, Lenin specifically, planted a time bomb, which resulted in the Russian Empire blowing apart, and that was, creating all of these republics and reinforcing these national identities which existed within them. And so, in fact, sorry for this kind of long digression at this point, but I think it's an important one. In many parts of the Soviet Union, the Soviet state went as far as to create written languages for many languages which previously had not possessed written languages. They required in the 1920s that all documents, government documents, be actually translated into this myriad number of languages, and did so to such an extent that local party officials, oftentimes from these local nationalities, would complain, "You're putting this extra burden on us. Do we have to put every bloody document into the local language?" There's been a lot of talk regarding Russia's attempts at creating this sense of disunity or discord in Europe and even in the United States. I think it's a little bit overblown, which is not to suggest that it doesn't exist. But within Russia, there's this kind of simplistic view of the effects of the Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America in terms of what they were able to achieve in the late Soviet period. So you do have some within within Russia who think that, well, it's time to give the West a little bit of their own medicine on this. I mean, we can play this game too. I think on the whole, it really doesn't have that much effect. Although, of course, we are seeing that within the European Union right now, there's a great deal of discord. I don't think Russia is having much success in terms of fueling it. I think it has to do with internal dynamics that exist within the European Union itself, and the failure of the monetary union, chiefly, of course, with the euro, and the austerity policies which have had to be put in place in order to try and maintain that monetary union. So, I mean, that's the reason why we've had this situation with Brexit in the UK, and of course, with the increasing popularity of Le Pen in France, Jobbik, of course, in Hungary, and the conservative party's rise in Poland. The European Union itself is highly flawed and is giving, of course, rise to these populist movements. And, of course, the same thing has happened here, hasn't it, as well, with Donald Trump, and to a certain extent with Bernie Sanders as well, before he was dispatched in the primary elections. There is this growing sense that, for lack of a better term, capitalism is not working. And it's no longer producing economic growth, it's producing increasing inequality. And there is this growing sense, both in Europe and in the United States, I think, that governments are doing nothing to address this, that they just don't care.
Well, we've got just a minute or so left, but I couldn't let you escape without a comment on the role Russia is playing in the U.S. presidential election. It's in some circles being touted as profound, and others probably not so much.
Yeah, I think the answer is not so much. And of course, these email dumps have had very little impact. I think the greater concern is this kind of almost new McCarthyism, which has emerged, except not coming from the Republican Party this time, but from the Democrats. And so Hillary Clinton, somebody, by the way, that I'll be voting for, just because I think the judicial appointments that she will make will be better than those that her opponent will make. that she has fanned these flames of discord between Russia and the United States. Not that there was none there to begin with, but it's been very useful politically for her to deflect criticism away from, again, the email controversy and all of these other issues by suggesting that Russia is at the source of all this, and they may be. It's hard to say. We just don't know, but. It's very difficult to talk rationally about Russia today because it's become very politicized. So if one tries to talk rationally about Russia, then all of a sudden one gets accused of being a Trump apologist, for instance. I mean, so it's unfortunate.
Well, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Welcome back once again, and we'll look forward to talking with you again as things develop on this front. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.